Good morning. My name is Toby Heaps. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Corporate Knights, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you here today for the launch of the second edition of the Canadian Pension Dashboard for Responsible Investing. We have a great group of panelists from some of the most significant pensions that are leading the way here in Canada, and report authors to give you a sort of high-level overview on the state of play in Canadian pensions and responsible investment. I'm happy to report that we track a number of things, but I'm happy to report on the three of the key measures that we look at that are really indicative about where pension funds are going. We're seeing progress. It could be faster, but we're seeing progress across the board and in significant steps. In terms of the number of funds this year with net zero commitments, it rose from 2 funds last year to 9 funds, the major funds this year. In terms of the funds which articulate a definition and report their assets that are invested in sustainability themes, the amount of money invested rose from 163 billion to 276 billion, roughly 13% of all assets. So nice to see that number going up, because what gets funded gets done. And also looking at the critical measure of how people get paid within the pension funds. Last year, we detected 4 of the major funds which linked executive remuneration bonuses to hitting sustainability targets. This year, that number's 10. So we're seeing good progress and still room for further progress. And the reason this matters so much, it matters for pensioners' ability to collect from their pensions and also to retire in a world worth retiring in. And it matters because the pension sector in Canada is globally recognized, especially our leaders, our Maple 8 and beyond, are recognized as real trailblazers for being ahead of the trend and showing how you can really run a pension fund to maximize the benefit for beneficiaries and the society that they're retiring in. And in Canada, the pension fund sector, if you add it all up, is $4 trillion. It's a huge number, double our GDP. If you take just the largest 35 funds, over 2 trillion. So we looked at, this year, we looked at some of the largest funds that had requisite information. And my colleague Matthew will run you through that. And we worked out the numbers. If you just took the sort of biggest funds in Canada that have roughly 2 trillion, and you took 5% of their assets, and that on an annual basis, that was invested into sustainability purposes, that's more than the entire climate funding gap, the $100 billion climate funding gap that exists in Canada today. So just to sort of give a sense of the power of pension funds. We also noticed in our studies, and Matthew will give some more color on this, that when you look at the returns that the pension funds earn from the more sustainable assets, even up to and including this year with a high watermark for oil stocks, they earned more money from their sustainable investments than they earned from their high carbon investments. So it's really interesting to see that even taking into account recent events, from a fiduciary sort of just financial performance perspective, there's a really compelling argument there to move faster just strictly for the financial interest of beneficiaries. So with that, I'll do a brief land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce Eric St. Pierre, and we'll get into the report and then have a discussion with the pension fund folks we have with us here today. So Corporate Knights honors the people and land of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Eric St. Pierre. Eric leads many of the significant climate policy and research and activist initiatives in the country through his role at the Trottier Family Foundation. And we're really proud to be working together with the Trottier Family Foundation, who supported this report for the second year in a row. So Eric, over to you.
Great, thanks, Toby. Thanks for having me on, and for Corporate Knights for taking the lead on this work. So I'm Eric St. Pierre, Executive Director of the Trottier Foundation. We're a Montreal-based foundation and climate funder focused on mitigating climate change through granting programmatic initiatives and also through our own investments. As a climate funder, we're actually really proud to be supporting the second edition of the Canadian Pensions Dashboard, because the bar for what constitutes best practice for responsible investing seems to be rising in Canada. So this is really exciting. That being said, this week's IPCC report really highlighted that time is of the essence for addressing the climate crisis. Meeting pension obligations for someone young like myself, who's more likely to retire in about 30 years from now, is strongly linked to the success of managing climate risks. So I think the conversation today that will be generated from the second pensions dashboard is likely to be very nuanced and complex, but a really important one to be had. So I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us today, see over 100 participants, and a special shout out to today's panelists, Corporate Knights and Smart Prosperity for your diligent work, and also the many experts who worked tirelessly to make this report a success. Again, really excited to see this report come out and excited for today's discussion. Back to you, Toby.
Thanks, Eric. And so we're going to get into the details of the report now. There's two parts of this. There's the actual findings in the report, the analysis, and then there's the policy recommendations. And we partnered with Smart Prosperity. We have Derek Eaton, who worked on those policy recommendations along with his colleagues at Smart Prosperity and our advisors to give us an overview of those recommendations after we go through the analysis. So at this point, I'll pass it off to Matthew Malinsky, who's the manager of the research division at Corporate Knights and led the research on this project to take us on a tour. Matt, over to you.
So yes, I'm going to go the high-level overview of the findings of the second edition of the Canadian Pensions Dashboard for Responsible Investing. So the Canadian pension fund sector is a source of income security and financial prowess that's respected around the world. In total, this sector controls over $4 trillion of assets, with more than half of that being held by just the 35 largest funds. The main aims and objectives of this dashboard are to advance ESG objectives, motivate and inform practice improvement amongst pension funds, and to also pilot an approach that could be applied to other institutions and ecosystems in the future. An assessment of the performance of 14 major Canadian pension funds on sustainable impact, sustainable governance, and financial performance indicators was conducted, drawing from publicly available documents. These indicators included annualized rates of return, breakdowns of investments by asset classes, allocations of capital to sustainable solutions, measurements of carbon footprints, current active sustainability commitments, and remuneration practices, amongst other measures. The preliminary findings were presented to the funds, allowing a period for feedback and providing the opportunity for the funds to address any gaps there may have been within their public disclosures. So our assessment initially targeted the 28 largest funds in Canada by assets under management, with 14 of these funds providing detailed disclosure that permitted meaningful analysis. The focus was on entities that control investments and ESG integration. This assessment tracks the progress that 11 funds that were included in the first edition of the dashboard have made across a suite of sustainability indicators between 2020 and 2022, with additional insights into 3 funds that were added to the roster. These 3 funds are the Desjardins Group Pension Plan, the Investment Management Corporation of Ontario, and the University Pension Plan. So now on to the findings. Disclosure on investments and solutions varies significantly across the funds, with 11 of the 14 funds disclosing the total amount in self-defined low-carbon solutions, which accounts for more than $276 billion, which represents nearly 13% of total assets under management across these 14 funds. This is actually a growth of more than 50% from the disclosed solutions total of $163 billion in the first iteration of this dashboard, which is partially attributable to new fund additions that include IMCO and DGPP. PSP is a leader amongst the funds, with 20% of its total portfolio AUM invested in sustainable solutions. That is defined as investments that align with the PSP green asset taxonomy. CDPQ has the second highest proportion of assets invested in solutions at 17%, followed by OMERS at 15%. CDPQ also has the largest volume of sustainable solutions, totaling $71 billion, with CPPIB reporting the second largest portfolio of solutions at $66 billion, which accounts for 12% of their total AUM. The approaches employed across the funds to measuring carbon footprints continues to vary significantly, with the coverage of assets included in these footprint calculations ranging from 40% all the way up to 100%. While 11 of the funds calculate carbon footprints for their portfolios, only 9 currently report a total portfolio footprint. Many of these funds are reporting under the financed emissions approach, although there has been an increase in the use of the weighted average carbon intensity, also known as the WACI method. In the context of this dashboard, best practice, which is indicated by a green cell on the slide, requires disclosure on the entire fund footprint, including breakdown by major asset classes and a reduction in emissions intensity by 7% per year. OTPP was the clear leader, reporting a substantial 32% reduction in portfolio carbon intensity, while OMERS reduced its intensity by 26% and AIMCO reported an 18% improvement. As was the case for the first iteration of this dashboard, there are many data gaps for carbon footprints, and there's no common approach to dealing with them, which makes fund-to-fund comparisons difficult even at the specific asset class level. Since the first edition of the dashboard, as Toby mentioned, the number of large funds with a commitment to achieving net zero by 2050 rose from 2 to 9, representing 81% of the total pension fund assets that were evaluated in this assessment. PSP has made significant capital allocation targets by 2026, that which includes increasing investments in green assets to $70 billion and transition assets to $7.5 billion. And this is coupled with a moderate anticipated reduction of portfolio emissions of 20 to 25%. IMCO, OMERS, and UPP have committed to a minimum reduction of 50% in portfolio emissions intensity by 2030, whereas CDPQ, HOOP, and OTPP have set comparable emissions reduction targets, but coupled those with green asset allocation targets. It was encouraging in this year's dashboard to see that sustainability is being baked into the governance function. A total of 10 large funds, up from 4 in 2020, now tie executive compensation to the achievement of sustainability targets, although work does remain to be done on fleshing out the details of these links, as none of the funds disclose the percentage of the CEO's variable comp that is tied to the achievement of said E&S sustainability targets, E&S being environmental and social. CEO compensation was disclosed by 11 of the funds for 2021, ranging from $830,000 to $6.9 million, with the average ratio increasing from 10 to 1 to 12 to 1 between 2020 and 2021. And that is the CEO to average employee pay ratio that I'm referring to here. CDPQ and IMCO had the lowest CEO to average employee pay ratios at 7 to 1, while OMERS had the highest at 23 to 1. On the composite leadership diversity metric, which is an assessment of both gender and racial diversity at both the board of directors and executive management levels, the average diversity was 26%, which sadly indicates virtually no progress since the first iteration of the dashboard. On the shareholder resolution front, while 7 of the 14 funds disclosed the number of ESG proposals voted on in 2021, only 6 reported the percentage of E&S proposals that were supported. Canada Post was the clear leader amongst the funds, supporting 91% of environmental and 81% of social resolutions. We also saw a significant increase on environmental and social competencies amongst pension fund board directors, with 5 fund boards being comprised of 50% or more competent members, while the average of E&S competent board members across the funds more than doubled, reaching 34%. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you're going to find the 10-point sustainable pensions checklist, which indicates best practice across the suite of sustainability indicators that were utilized in this analysis. Despite the positive trend that has been seen on the sustainable impact indicators, more effort is needed to ensure that these funds are fulfilling their fiduciary duty to their plan members and are going to be managing the significant risks and opportunities that are associated with climate change. All funds are encouraged to set credible science-based targets for achieving net zero by 2050 or sooner, with roadmaps that are specifying both short and intermediate GHG emission reduction targets, coupled with sustainable solution investment allocations. Currently, only 5 of the funds out of the 14 that were assessed have done this. As Toby mentioned, we estimate that a sustainable investment allocation representing 20% of total assets is required for funds to play their role in financing the transition. Yet the majority of the funds that were included in this dashboard are far from achieving this. Of the 14 funds that were assessed, there were $276 billion out of an identified 2.2 trillion AUM that were tagged as sustainable investments. So not only does this total amount of sustainable investment fall short of the target, but this total is currently mapped to inconsistent definitions that are set by the funds themselves. And this happens to include tens of billions of dollars in run-of-the-mill real estate investments that would not meet stringent sustainability criteria. Moving forward, we expect to see the funds mapping their investments to a standardized definition of what constitutes a sustainable investment. The work that is currently being done by Canada's Sustainable Finance Action Council in developing a green and transition taxonomy is setting the foundation for this much needed standardization of definitions on this front. On the emissions reduction front, all funds need to be targeting a minimum 7% annual reduction in emissions intensity, granularly reported with a coverage on the vast majority of their AUM and broken down by major asset classes. On the reporting front, there is a mild preference for reporting under the WACI method versus financed emissions, as this is the preferred metric of the TCFD and works across asset classes for comparative purposes. Significant progress is still needed on the sustainable governance indicators, despite the advancements that were made on increasing the degree of E and S competency on the fund boards. The level of composite gender and racial diversity on both executive management teams and the board of directors still sits well below identified best practice and is virtually unchanged since the release of the first iteration of this dashboard in 2021. While there has been an increase in the disclosure on shareholder E&S voting, under half the funds are reporting this currently. Regarding the sustainability pay link, granular disclosure on the details of the pay link with a minimum of 20% of a CEO's variable pay being tied to the stated target is the standard for best practice moving forward. And all funds are also encouraged to reinforce their governance standards by publishing formal policies related to ensuring that fund lobbying activities and industry association memberships are aligned with a just transition. So in closing, I just wanted to highlight the results of a 10-year backtest on the fund's public equity holdings to measure the impact that divestment on oil and gas stocks would have on the cumulative fund return. In every single case, divestment of oil and gas led to a greater cumulative return over the 10-year period, notwithstanding the banner year that oil and gas stocks had in 2022. The average delta was 29% difference, while the greatest return differences were seen at OMERS at 62% after divestment over a 10-year period and AIMCO at 54%. Thank you, Toby. That's all from me, and I will pass it back to you, and I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you, Matt. That was a tour de force. Great summary, and good to see the progress and also the call to action to close remaining gaps. Derek, you with the team at Smart Prosperity put together some of the policy recommendations to help speed things along, to keep us in line with the best practice and make sure that our policy ecosystem that was central to creating the pension powerhouses, the Maple 8 and beyond that we have, continues in this period of rather disruptive industrial change that we're going through. And so it'd be really interesting to get your perspective. And for everyone here, Derek is the Director of Industrial Policy at the Transition Accelerator. And before he started that role, he did significant work with his colleagues on this report with Smart Prosperity. But Derek, over to you.
Thanks, Toby. I would like to further acknowledge that at Smart Prosperity, the work in particular of Anik Islam, Senior Research Associate, who unfortunately can't be joining us today. I really feel as though he should be presenting Smart Prosperity's contribution to the second edition of the dashboard. But I'm pleased too, as I was engaged in more in a guidance role with Anik, and I'd like to also acknowledge another colleague, Catherine Monahan, who's also provided some recommendations. But just to try and move through this quickly, there's a lot that's happening on the sustainable finance landscape, and there's a lot that's happening in the pensions landscape. We made last year in the first edition of the report a number of recommendations, and it's actually, I think, important to just highlight how fast things have been changing. I think there's still that's not to say we are where we want to be, or as Toby was saying, that the pace of change is perhaps as fast as we need. But it is important to recognize what's happening. So there's three areas I'd just like to to go through quickly in terms of developments since last year's report. The first of those is around net zero target setting and transition planning. Some of these things have been mentioned by things, across various initiatives by different stakeholders, particularly internationally, to establish target setting approaches that are applicable for pension funds as well as other asset managers that are providing guidance on what could be credible net zero targets, including what emissions coverage should be, the treatment of different asset classes. And a number of these include the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance Target Setting Protocol, very interesting initiative, as well as the Paris Aligned Investments Initiative investment framework that was already there last year. The Science Based Targets Initiative as well has made some additional progress. Implementing these global approaches to target setting, we expect that would help provide further transparency and establish credibility. It is worth remembering, I think, that addressing these challenges is not insurmountable, but there are challenges that in terms of availability of data, disclosure, frameworks to support the target setting, getting into the weeds on scenario planning. There are a lot of, I think the main message here is we see in terms of both pension funds as well as regulatory agencies and perhaps even other stakeholders, there's a need for added effort to work through these challenges. They're not inconsequential, and in some cases it's a question of further research, but it's also a question of getting the right heads together and agreeing on certain standards and approaches. So second area relates to taxonomies, which was mentioned by Matt already. Since last year now, there's been the publication by the Sustainable, under the auspices of the Sustainable Finance Action Council, of a proposed taxonomy roadmap for both green and transition investments. I think it's important to recognize here that this is one of the first taxonomies globally to include a transition category, which is on top of, in addition to a green category, and that's no small. I think we have to recognize that's no small feat, and of course, it's particularly relevant for the Canadian economy. Hopefully this taxonomy, in a sense, process and a taxonomy itself will emerge as soon as possible or be approved and put into motion. It's also interesting to note that this taxonomy, which has been very carefully developed with strong participation from Canada's financial institutions, including pension funds, number of pension funds have been very active in contributing their comments on the development of this taxonomy. It will also help us measure better, of course, progress towards the investment targets and filling that gap to 120 or 140, up to $40 billion annually that's required. Then the third and the last area I'd just like to mention is disclosures, climate-related financial disclosures, where we have seen again considerable progress internationally, and that's reflected also in the discussions and what's happening in Canada. The International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, has released its climate-related disclosure rules. And the final draft is expected this year, with an implementation for next year. That standard includes a requirement for disclosures on value chain emissions, including Scope 3. Again, that's a bit of a tricky nut to crack, but it can be cracked. as well as net zero transition scenario planning. Of course, there's things taking place in the United States under the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as further work in Europe. Canada now has its own Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, which is meant to help support the implementation of the ISSB's standard within Canada. So in Canada, of course, we have a very fragmented regulatory landscape for pension funds. And so it's important that all of the relevant actors, including OSFI and CAPSA and the specific pension supervisory authorities, but this also applies to, at the end of the day, the CSA and some other bodies, that they are work to be aligned together with on the ISSB standards and in a sense provide the right type of support and catalyst for Canadian pension funds to be able to improve their own disclosures on climate-related risks according to these new emerging standards. So I'll leave it at there, Toby. I think there's plenty of material, more material in the report, but I think it's encouraging to see how things are moving, and then let's see how we can get them to move more quickly. Back to you.
Thanks, Derek. That was really helpful. So we have with us three of the people who are into the angel and the details, because there's a lot of angel in the details if you get them right. It's the other character if we don't get them right. So we've got three people here who are really into trying to get the angel and the details right on some really important themes. Aaron, who many of you will know, has had a career in the climate sustainability movement going back some years, and is bringing that knowledge now into the pension sector with PSP. Aaron's the Director of Climate Advisory Sustainability and the Climate Innovation Group at PSP Investments, which is one of the Maple 8 and one of the more significant pension funds by size. And as Matthew noted, was the leader in terms of the percentage of assets invested in sustainable solutions as per the PSP taxonomy, which PSP has spent a fair bit of time going into and has also collaborated with other funds and shared. And it's one of the nice things we've seen about the pension fund community in Canada is it's quite collaborative, and there's a lot of information sharing, so we can move faster than places in pension funds in, say, for example, in the States, where it's not quite as cohesive as what we have here in Canada. But Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about, so PSP 20% of the total assets of this massive pension fund are invested in sustainable investments, according to the taxonomy that you and your team worked on to develop and then now track investments. How did you create this taxonomy? What was the the formula?
Yeah. Thanks, Toby, for the question. And thanks for inviting us to be here today and for all the work that you and your team have done to build this report. I think it's really insightful, and have really thought it's interesting the comments that your team have outlined this morning in terms of policy recommendations to move us all collectively forward. So as you mentioned, PSP, we built a green asset taxonomy, which really helps us measure our exposure to climate change risks and opportunities. And the reason we built an in-house framework was because we wanted to develop our inaugural climate change strategy. And we felt that while there was significant guidance in the market around science-based plans, there were guidance to corporates, there was no one tool that would help us as an asset owner to measure our exposure across many geographies, across many sectors, across many asset classes. More recently, of course, the Sustainable Finance Action Council has come out with the taxonomy, which is, very substantive and very similar in principle to the taxonomy that we've developed. So we thought it was really important to identify the key variables for which we wanted to measure over time. So we were thinking about the carbon intensity, of course, of our portfolio, of individual asset classes, individual companies themselves, as well as the credibility and the maturity of their transition plans. So this is sort of how we thought about our two-dimensional framework, which would look at the carbon intensity of each company normalized by the revenues of that same year, and then their transition plan. And through that fairly simple 2D framework, we were able to collect data on most of our asset classes, most of our AUM, and go through a process of better understanding our baseline. And that was really important for us in terms of coming into the market with a climate commitment that we felt was authentic, that was ambitious, but also achievable, and that we would be able to measure and report our progress against.
And can you say a little bit about, that's helpful background, can you say a little bit about the targets? Matthew mentioned some of the 2026 targets, but your sort of targets on the carbon intensity and then on the green and transition side, and sort of how you kind of, what was the thinking that went into setting those targets? Like, how did you determine those numbers?
Sure. So the first thing we did was we built our taxonomy. We set a very important rule, which is that we wanted to have data on all of our positions in order to be able to include them as mapped in our taxonomy. And so we went through a process of collecting Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG data, as well as information on transition plans. And we established our initial baseline in terms of our exposure to green assets, so about 40 billion of our AUM at that time. And we wanted to set targets over a meaningful time frame for PSP. So of course, as was mentioned off the top, the IPCC, the Paris Agreement, the world is moving towards global net zero by 2050, or ideally sooner, in order to keep 1.5 on the table. But we wanted to have a strategy that was actionable in the short term as well. So we thought that we would give ourselves a 5-year period of time under which we would be assessing our progress against these targets. So we've established that we would like to grow our exposure to green assets to 70 billion by 2026. We would like to grow our exposure to transition assets to 7.5 billion over the same period. And we will be reducing our exposure to carbon intensive companies with no transition plans by 50%. And this is really important for us. We do not have a position on divestment. So we are not divesting as a first course of action in terms of achieving our climate targets, but we are graduating companies from carbon intensive no plan into transition assets. And so that's really the very important evolution that we're monitoring across our portfolio. And through that effort, we have also modeled that we will be reducing our portfolio carbon footprint by 20 to 25% over the same period. So the net effect of moving assets into green, moving assets into transition, and reducing our exposure to carbon will, of course, be decarbonizing our portfolio over time.
And some people, they challenge that, pension fund shouldn't be thinking about setting non-financial targets for example, say green asset exposure. In the work, I think Matthew referenced it, but when we looked at the performance of sort of the companies that would meet most green definitions, the 430 global companies cross sectors, we looked at their cumulative performance over the last 10 years. It was around 368%, which was really interesting because that was double what the average pension fund turned in their public equity asset classes. So I'm just wondering, like, when you have that discussion internally, how do you kind of get over the objections where people say, look, you set a non-financial green target, you're kind of playing with the pensioners' money, where's the financial anchor? How do you respond to that?
Well, our climate strategy, of course, is entirely consistent with our mandate, which is to maximize returns without undue risk of loss. But the concept of maximizing returns, and so too the concept of undue risk of loss, is inherently connected to climate, both risk and opportunity. So we need to be measuring and managing our exposure to the risk and to the opportunity in order to execute our mandate. And so that's a really important aspect of why, of course, we're doing this, because we believe it's in the best interest of our beneficiaries to be positioned from a leading perspective with respect to climate. So that's a key part of our approach.
It'd be interesting. I'm not sure if you're doing this internally, but it'd be interesting to, over the years, to if you're tracking the sort of financial performance of the kind of green assets versus the transition versus the rest by asset class, to sort of see how that kind of tracks over time. In 1 year, you can have anomalies, of course, but it'd be interesting to see how that tracks.
Yeah, and Matthew mentioned the back testing work that your team has done, and we're looking into doing similar analysis. Of course, we don't just hold public equities; we are very large investors in private markets. We have private debt asset classes, and so it's part of the interesting process of managing this taxonomy implementation internally at PSP. Is we're collecting quite a lot of data, and of course, we already have the data on the financial performance of these companies, and so it's possible for us to connect the ESG data and specifically the climate data with financial information, and that will make us better investors. And that's, again, a key part of this approach, is being more knowledge driven, being more insightful, and ensuring that we are continually delivering the best possible returns for our beneficiaries.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. It seems like we're kind of at a bit of a turning point or rupture in the mindset that sustainable investing or investing in low carbon opportunities used to be sort of about a compliance or kind of a reputational risk management issue, and now it's kind of moving into, this is how you get extra mojo. This is how you juice returns in the portfolio, get exposure to secular trends that are driving global economic growth. And so it's interesting when it turns from that sort of sword issue. With Preston Manning would talk about issues. There's sword issues and there's shield issues. There's sword issues and there's shield issues. And I guess it was a shield issue. It's been a shield issue for a long time. And now the sustainable investing is becoming a sword issue. It's about going on the offense. So it's really great to see you guys leading the way there at 20%. So just last question for you, and we'll have a discussion. So with Karen and Carmen too. But the Canadian taxonomy, you referenced that it's broadly similar. How are you sort of managing? How are you reacting to that in terms of, is it being integrated or tagged, or is it? I guess it's just the roadmap at this point. But how are you sort of integrating that into your approach?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, we welcome the roadmap report. We think it's really, really insightful and quite important in terms of convergence in the Canadian market, right? And this comment has come up already today, that there are different definitions of green and transition, and I think that's well intentioned. We're all trying to make progress, but at the end of the day, apples to apples comparison will require some degree of convergence around definitions. And so we're really keen to stay involved in the conversation on that. And from this roadmap report, more specific thresholds will be developed for individual industries. We've seen this already, for example, in the EU taxonomy, and we've looked at that document quite a lot in terms of the development of our own green asset taxonomy and also in the development of our green bond framework. So we think it's great, and there's a lot more work to do, of course, to make sure that it's data driven, it's quantitative, it's practical from an implementation perspective, because at the end of the day, we all have very large funds that do require a lot of analytical work in terms of coming to these conclusions. So we want to make sure it stays practical and as data driven as possible, but we think it can be quite helpful for all of us. Okay, great. Well, thanks. Those are great insights. Karen, we're going to move over to you. Karen Lockridge is the director of ESG investing for the Canada Post pension plan, one of the larger plans outside of the Maple 8, and has a really strong strategic alignment to be a leader on sustainable investing within their mandate. And Karen also helps lead up the technical committee for the Climate Engagement Canada approach that is looking to engage with the biggest emitters in Canada and help them speed up their transition plans so that they can be aligned with a low carbon future and thrive in it. And as you saw from Matthew's presentation, Canada Post is leading on the sort of the shareholder engagement side in a lot of ways in terms of the percent of resolutions that they support. And so Karen is a real expert on this, how you engage with companies and use the power of your investment dollars, your pension investment dollars, to help those companies along the way and to improve and remain and become better investments. So Karen, first question for you: how can pension funds engage companies to speed up the transition? Sort of the Cole's Notes version.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks, and thanks for having me here today. I mean, I think there's many ways to engage, and I think it's important to recognize, regardless of the size of your pension fund, there's ways to do this. This could be through engaging through your external asset managers or through third-party engagement providers and through proxy voting, as well as the collaborative initiatives, Climate Engagement Canada that you mentioned. So I think for us, the first step is getting clear on the North Star, the net zero by 2050, in line with the 1.5 degree pathway. That's the basis for the Science-Based Target Initiative, as well as the two key collaborative investor engagement initiatives that we're involved in, Climate Action 100+, which is the global version of Climate Engagement Canada that was launched over 5 years ago. And that has 166 or so companies in the target list. Only 6 of those are Canadian, and hence that's why the Sustainable Finance Expert Panel on Sustainable Finance really recommended in their report they released a couple of years ago that we develop sort of a Canadian version of Climate Action 100+. So Climate Engagement Canada was launched last year. It's got 40 focused companies, which I'll speak to a bit more, but just a few other ways that we engage is through our external managers. So we're about 30 billion of assets under management. Some of that we manage internally, some of it externally, and all of us need to sort of right-size our approach to fit the resources. So we expect our external public equity managers to be engaging on our behalf, and we've been updating our investment management agreements to, clarify that and ask them to be reporting on that.
Okay, that's helpful. And you mentioned the Climate Engagement Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about how Climate Engagement Canada is supporting this sort of speeding up the transition, and what we can what's happened and what we can expect to see happening in the coming year?
Yeah, I mean, we've got our own unique economy and challenges, and Climate Action 100+ is, there's a lot of investors collaborating in that. For many global investors, Canada may be a smaller portion of their portfolio. So Climate Engagement Canada was really meant to sort of focus efforts on Canadian companies and the Canadian economy. And it's really meant to be a dialogue. Certainly I'm personally learning a lot from my peers. You mentioned the collaboration with peers, but also with companies themselves. And I think a key benefit of Climate Engagement Canada is it brings sort of a unified voice, both with equity investors as well as fixed income. And as I mentioned, it's really meant to be a two-way dialogue. In terms of what to expect, we are trying to leverage the learnings of Climate Action 100+. Climate Action 100+ has developed a benchmark to report progress over the years. So we did a consultation late in 2022 on that. We've recently, as you mentioned, I'm a member of the chair of the technical committee. So we've recently reviewed the results, and we'll be launching the final version of the Climate Engagement Canada benchmark. So this is how we will assess companies going forward. So more to come on that. Yeah.
Great. And how do you, so I think there's a philosophical predisposition among reasonable people to want to engage rather than take your ball and go home, from a sort of just a community perspective, even though taking your ball and go home can be a more profitable strategy sometimes. But we need the constructive investors to be engaged for the transition. And so it's great that so many are philosophically disposed there. But how do you know that you're not wasting your time? Like, how do you know, what's the litmus test to know if engagement is working or not?
Well, a couple of things. In terms of engaging over, taking the money or divesting, we at Canada Post, we're focused, or we emphasize emissions reductions in the real economy. And, we're focused on, the 40th largest or most significant emitters in Canada. We need them to be on board across their whole range of activities, setting targets as well as their decarbonization strategy, that they're engaging their suppliers, their clients, that they're aligning their CapEx, and that they're aligning their climate lobbying or influence. And we can't engage directly with too many companies. Obviously, we're resource constrained, but the ones that we are involved in, they're very receptive. They're hearing this from a broad range of stakeholders. We get meetings with the CEO and in some cases the board, certain board members. So clearly they're making it a priority. And I mean, in the short term, how do we know if we're making progress? One is that they're actively engaged at the most senior levels of the organization as well as the board. And over time, we need to see the emissions reduced and CapEx aligned.
So it's interesting you pull those points, the CapEx and the lobbying. Those are, so that's where a lot of the action is. If I may probe, so let's say we're talking about a company, TransAlta, for example. So TransAlta has a really strong, robust sort of net zero plan in theory. It looks strong, but when you look at their sort of current revenue, its majority is still coming from their thermal fossil base, similar to a lot of utilities around the world. So that's really not and so there should be a real opportunity there to kind of drive that down and to decarbonize that thermal fossil fuel portfolio. And they are making significant investments, much larger than they used to be making. But when you kind of compare them, say on a CapEx, percent of CapEx into low carbon renewable energy, they kind of look at about 50%. And if you compare them to say leaders like Iberdrola or Enel that also have large thermal bases, and Enel is a similar size thermal base, majority of their revenue is still from fossil fuel. They're at sort of 80-85%, approaching 90% of their CapEx over the last 3 years. And so I wonder, like, how do you sort of kind of process that information and figure out, how do you use that information maybe to get the TransAltas of the world to maybe move a little faster so that they don't get left behind. I'm just kind of, because it seems like there's so many moving parts, but at the end of the day, what gets done gets done. And the words are nice, but the sort of money is a little bit more honest. So what can you do with that kind of information to speed things up?
Yeah, there's a couple things. TransAlta does have goals. They said just announced a net zero by 2045. They've got a clean electricity growth plan. And so it's going to be a transition, So any company would still have their, legacy business operations, assets, and those need to be transitioned. And, the climate transition taxonomy recognizes that. So I think it's monitoring a couple metrics, and you mentioned them both. CapEx going forward, and there will have to be, capital investments sort of supporting the transition of existing assets, as well as the growth of, the new business strategy, whatever that might be, and monitoring revenue over time. So that should also be a shift, and TransAlta has a specific target for transitioning that as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm thinking like Enel is the biggest power company in the Western world with a massive thermal sort of current infrastructure, the fossil infrastructure, and they're managing to sort of figure out how to put 85% of their total CapEx into renewables growth. And there's some maintenance going on their gas and some of their coal infrastructure. And they did it in sort of 6 years. They thought it would take 20 years, and they did it in 6 years, shutting down 40 of their 50 coal-fired power plants. So it's interesting, just the speed that large Goliath actors like that can go at. It's interesting, just sort of kind of redefining what's possible. Okay, so Carmen, from my home province of Alberta, over with AIMCO, you guys made great progress last year on improving your carbon footprint, making it more efficient. But you've also done a lot of thinking, and we noticed in your reporting there's a lot of nuanced detail, angel detail on about carbon footprints. And we wanted to sort of just start off with you. What would you say is the biggest disclaimer about measuring portfolio carbon footprints? Because it's really one number, but sometimes it gets a lot of focus.
Yeah, no, and again, thanks for having me, echoing Karen and Aaron here. This is one of those conversations we could probably have just on this for 30 minutes, so I'll keep it brief. But in general, I think there's a lot of disclaimers on carbon footprint at this time. Number one is that there's still a lot of lag in the data. As Aaron mentioned, that's one of their goals, is to increase companies that are reporting data, because right now there's still a significant proportion that is estimated data. And that's true in public markets where we'd have big tools to help us, but even more so in the private side. So for example, on private equity, a lot of that is estimation based on, it could be the sector that the fund is in, or, various things. And so initiatives like data convergence initiative is important because we're trying to get more reported data, right? And that's going to be part of it. So because it's estimated, either that or there's a lag in the data. That's the second thing, is that, when we look at it really deeply, some of this, emissions data, it's only annually reported, but some of it is 2 years old. And so it's, still reflecting, I think, the pandemic. It hasn't fully been reflected in the data. So, that's part of that. So yes, we were down 18%. Some of that is data. Some of it is decisions we've made, but a lot of that is still, data to come. So I feel like that's part of it. The second thing, if anyone is starting down this path, is that methodology is important, right? So right now, as you mentioned, there's weighted average carbon intensity, and then there's financed emissions. So they measure different things. They're totally, one is like a revenue based and the other one is enterprise value. And so it's different things. One is your exposure, and then one's balance sheet and one's more income statement based. And so they're measuring different things. You're looking at the intensity of the entity itself, or am I trying to figure out what emissions should be attributed to us as the investor based on our ownership in that company? So they're very different things. And that's why the numbers are 47 and 100 and something, because they're different things. And so part of it is, I think, as we move towards standardization, and there's got to be convergence on what we're trying to do here, because I think that's important too. As you said, right now it's apples and oranges a lot of times. And because we joined the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, we've really focused on this financed emissions, and we're now trying to be more transparent, right? We are reporting by asset class, we're showing you all of these things as now stakeholders, but there's still a long way to go. So there's a lot of different components that we need to figure out before it's really, standardized and, all of those things.
Yeah, that's helpful. And when you have when you're looking at the portfolio, you're thinking about how to optimize the footprint and how to measure it. What's the sort of process when you're trying to figure out how to optimize the efficiency of the portfolio? How do you go through that?
Yeah, so there's, I think, a few things. And one is, maybe I always want to say very honestly, thank you to PSP for the development of their asset taxonomy. They've really, as you said, it's public now, and they've handed it to everyone else to use. And that's really important because I think it's the next step in this evolution. So for a long time, we've been calculating these emissions, right? So whether it's intensity over revenue or intensity over EVIC, as we mentioned, it's an intensity number. And so when you think about, for the public, for clients, even for others, 47, 52, these are just numbers. So what do we do with it? And so I think what's been really nice about this taxonomy is it takes intensity as one measure, and then whether the company is ready for transition is another really important measure. And so we start to look at historically how they've done, but then also thinking about how they're organized for the future. And so that's become really important for us, having taken PSP's taxonomy, having labeled now our assets within the various buckets. So, high emitting, transition, and green, and then trying to figure out then, okay, what are we trying to move? As Aaron said, we're trying to move everything kind of to that top right, the way it's defined. And so, how are we going to do that? And I think the second thing is really being open to various technologies. So at the end of the day, we're like, okay, what is our role to play as the pension fund, right? We're not venture capitalists. Our job is to make sure that the pension money is here over the long term. I mean, that's ultimately what we have to do. And so thinking about, okay, where can we play? So, there's deals that come to us that are, a variety of things. So for example, in the last year, we've made investments in a hydrogen hub, and we've done it in battery technology, and we're looking at a variety of different things. And that's what we have to be thinking about, is there's not one silver bullet that's going to get us there. It has to be a variety of things that are going to get us there. So looking at a variety of deals is important as well.
Okay, that's interesting. It's interesting. I'm just thinking, when I think about the Aimco portfolio, some of the stuff you're doing with some of the major coal-fired power producers in the U.S., like some of the biggest ones, where you're providing the capital for them to move fairly rapidly, in the course of, in some cases, I think 5 years. By 2025, I think the case of AES, to completely eradicate coal from their portfolio and plowing into renewables. And obviously that owning them right now in your portfolio must be a huge kind of bump in your carbon footprint, because they still have but at the same time, the amount of emissions that are being corrected as you kind of help to finance their transition in a pretty rapid fashion. So those two metrics on the dashboard, like the footprint and the solutions, the green and the transition, is kind of the put in perspective. So, okay, well, it's really interesting. We have a number of questions. Some of them we've answered just in the chat, but one of the big questions that seems to be there in the Q&A is about the need for speed. And we saw the IPCC report. We need to be doing everything everywhere all at once. In the words of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And we really have, the scientists are telling us we really have to speed things up. We really kind of, the next 6 years are really kind of pivotal and critical. We were saying this 6 years ago as well, but it's the language has been amped up. And there's lots of talk of 2050, 2045, and it seems like a long way off. What do you think we can do to really kind of speed things up in the next 5 years? What do you think is the kind of key things for us to focus on as a kind of community here in Canada in terms of getting capital allocated? And that's sort of a question for everyone. But before we jump right into it, I wanted to have one last question with Carmen, because Carmen works with the Sustainable Finance Action Council, supporting her CEO is the co-chair of the Capital Allocation Group, and that group has a really important role, which is to figure out, where are the funding gaps and how do we correct those funding gaps for Canada in order to be able to achieve its net zero goals. And there's some great work going on there, and it'd be interesting just to get your perspective sitting within a pension fund. At a big picture level, what is the role of pension funds in financing the transition to a low carbon sustainable economy?
Yeah, no, and I think maybe it tags on to what I was wondering at the last question with, is really around thinking about what is our role to play. So again, we mentioned we're not venture capitalists, but we are looking, we invest over the long term. And so again, thinking about the different technologies that are there. I think what's been super interesting about the Sustainable Finance Action Council, just by definition of what this working group is trying to look at, is what are barriers today to try and help move more of this investment into these sustainable technologies. And so, here we are with the opportunity to provide real world experiences that then we can provide recommendations to, for example, government and others to say, okay, this is what has to change. There's all this discussion about how there's money here available. For example, we're looking for deals, but maybe it's the deal structure that has to change, or maybe it's, permitting that has to change, or it's regulatory that has to change. So there's lots of different opportunities, and it's still early in that discussion, but I think that's what we're trying to come up with, is figure out, okay, what if we made the following changes, okay, how would that help move deals forward? So I think that's really an important point for everybody, right, as we're all thinking about that.
That's helpful. And then in terms of how we speed things up, maybe Karen, and then last word for Aaron. How do we speed things up the next 5 years? And I don't know if you can weave this in, but we just had a question come in too about because Canada, it's a relevant question. What's the credible decarbonization pathway look like for a fossil fuel production company? If that fits, but don't feel obligated to sew it in. So I'll leave it to you to weave the yarn. Karen, what do we do to speed things up in the next 5 years?
Well, I would just take this opportunity to encourage any other investors that are on this call to join Climate Engagement Canada if they're not already on. I mean, it is, the focus companies are a good representation of the Canadian economy. So it's a good way to, contribute and be involved.
Great. Aaron?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. So in terms of accelerating the transition, I think there are many important levers that we need to pull, probably all at the same time. If I think about, internal policies and tools within the pension fund itself, we're starting to think at PSP about, for example, portfolio construction and how we make clear our capital allocation objectives from a climate perspective to our asset classes. At the end of the day, it's really important that our investors are clear on what their scope is and what their mandate is in terms of looking for these climate aligned opportunities. So portfolio construction is obviously very key. We've also talked a bit about linking compensation to climate targets, and this is obviously a feature of your report as well, Toby. So those are governance tools and accountability mechanisms that will create an alignment of interests that will create momentum. And something else we're thinking about a lot at PSP is around knowledge sharing and thought leadership. And it's part of the reason, we've published our taxonomy, and we've published a paper that gives you some sense of how we established the approach, the pros and cons, and how we hope to improve it over time. Carmen talked a lot about technologies, and I think that investors, not just pension investors, but the financial community more generally, could be more transparent with each other in terms of, these technologies, risks, and opportunities, and how we can buy down some of the perceived technology risk around climate solutions. So I think there's a lot we can do by being more open source and really leveraging our thought leadership around climate.
Okay, well, that we packed a lot there in 1 hour. I really appreciate the insights in your leadership, Karen, Aaron, and Carmen. And thanks, Eric, for all your support, and Derek and colleagues, Anik, and Matt and team at Corporate Knights for great work on this report. It's great to see things are speeding up, and we're going to be really focused on coming back next year and seeing hopefully seeing the electric throttle moving things in an even faster direction. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today for the questions. The report is live on our website with an article, and we look forward to tracking this progress on an annual basis going forward to next year, and wish everyone a great rest of the week. Thanks kindly. Take care.